The cafeteria of the Galactic Academy buzzed with the soft conversations of dozens of alien species, their voices creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and melodic tones that had become background music to Jake Martinez's daily existence. 3 weeks had passed since his arrival, and he still sat alone at the corner table, mechanically eating his meal while observing the intricate social dynamics playing out around him. Jake was the only human at the academy, part of an experimental exchange program designed to foster understanding between Earth and the peaceful civilizations of the galactic community. At 19, he had been selected for his academic achievements and psychological stability, traits the selection committee deemed essential for representing humanity to species that had never encountered a Death Worlder before. The whispers followed him everywhere. He caught fragments of conversations in various alien languages, but the universal translators ensured he understood every word. "That's the human," they would say, their voices dropping to hushed tones. "The one from the Death Planet." The Zenthari students would point with their elongated fingers before quickly looking away when he noticed. The crystalline Vex would shift their translucent bodies to deeper shades of blue whenever he passed, a color Jake had learned indicated anxiety and fear. What they feared, Jake couldn't entirely understand. He was just over 6 feet tall, with brown hair and what his friends back on Earth would call an average build. He wasn't particularly muscular or intimidating by human standards. But here, among beings who had evolved on worlds where the most dangerous creature was equivalent to Earth's butterflies, his very existence seemed to radiate an aura of barely contained violence. The Quartzian students were perhaps the most obvious in their discomfort. Their crystal bodies would flash rapid sequences of yellow and red whenever he entered a room, patterns that Professor Veln had explained indicated fight-or-flight responses. It was ironic, really. These beings possessed technology that could manipulate gravity, bend light, and travel faster than the speed of light, yet they instinctively recoiled from someone whose ancestors had simply learned to throw rocks with deadly accuracy. Jake finished his meal in silence and gathered his materials for the next class. As he stood, he noticed the immediate area around his table empty as nearby students found sudden reasons to relocate. A group of Zephyrian students, their blue skin shimmering under the cafeteria's artificial lights, watched him with wide, dark eyes that seemed to catalog his every movement as a potential threat. Walking through the corridors toward Professor Ornith's classroom, Jake reflected on the irony of his situation. He had come here to learn about other cultures, to build bridges between humanity and the galactic community. Instead, he had become a living reminder of everything these peaceful civilizations had worked to evolve beyond. His very presence challenged their fundamental belief that intelligence naturally led to pacifism. The academy itself was a testament to this philosophy. Its walls were made of transparent materials that could shift to opacity when needed, but were normally kept clear to promote openness and trust. The security systems were designed to handle equipment malfunctions and student disputes, not armed invasions. Emergency protocols existed for natural disasters and academic emergencies, but the academy's designers had never imagined a scenario where someone might actively try to harm the students and faculty. As Jake entered the classroom, he felt the familiar weight of 24 alien gazes following his movement. He had grown accustomed to being the center of nervous attention, though it never stopped feeling isolating. Professor Ornith, a tall Zephyrian with intelligent eyes and skin that shifted from blue to purple when she was deep in thought, nodded politely as he took his usual seat in the back corner. The seating arrangement had evolved naturally over his first week. No one had explicitly asked him to sit apart from the others, but an invisible barrier seemed to exist around him. The closest any student sat was 3 seats away, leaving Jake in a bubble of empty space that felt more isolating than any prison cell. Professor Ornith began her lecture with characteristic enthusiasm, her skin brightening to a warm blue that indicated engagement and intellectual excitement. "Today we will explore one of the most fundamental principles of galactic civilization," she announced, her voice carrying the musical quality common to her species. "The universal tendency toward peace that emerges when intelligent beings reach sufficient technological and social development." Jake listened with genuine interest as she outlined the core philosophy that governed interactions between the galaxy's 4 to 7 member species. According to galactic wisdom, violence was a primitive response that intelligent beings naturally outgrew. Wars between technologically advanced civilizations were considered not just unlikely, but impossible. Any species that retained aggressive tendencies would inevitably destroy itself before achieving interstellar travel. "The key principle," Professor Ornith continued, her skin now shifting to the deep purple that indicated she was reaching the crux of her argument, "is that all intelligent beings share a fundamental desire for peace, prosperity, and mutual understanding. When conflicts arise between civilized species, they occur because of misunderstandings or communication failures, not because of any inherent aggressive nature. Zilta, an empathic species with silver eyes that could literally sense the emotions of others, raised her delicate hand. But Professor, what about the historical records of wars between early civilizations? Didn't some species fight each other before joining the galactic community? Professor Ornith's expression grew patient, as if addressing a child's innocent but misguided question. Those conflicts occurred during the primitive phases of development, before these species had achieved true civilization. Once a species develops faster than light travel and encounters the galactic community, exposure to peaceful philosophies naturally eliminates any remaining aggressive tendencies. Jake felt a familiar stirring of disagreement, but he had learned to choose his moments carefully. His questions often made his classmates uncomfortable, and Professor Ornith, while always polite, seemed to view his perspectives as evidence of humanity's incomplete evolution toward true civilization. The lecture continued with examples of successful conflict resolution between member species. Trade disputes resolved through mediation. Territory disagreements settled through careful negotiation. Resource allocation determined by committee consensus. It was an impressive record of peaceful coexistence that had lasted for over 1,000 years. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was missing from this worldview. Finally, he raised his hand. "Professor Ornith," he said, his voice cutting through the gentle murmur of alien voices, "what about species that attack others specifically for resources they need to survive? Or groups that seem to enjoy causing pain and suffering to others?" The classroom fell silent. Jake felt the weight of 24 alien gazes fixing on him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed fear. Professor Ornith's skin shifted to a pale blue that Jake had learned indicated careful consideration mixed with concern. "Mr. Martinez," she replied after a long pause, "such beings exist only in the most primitive societies. Once a species achieves advanced technology and joins the galactic community, they naturally evolve beyond such behavior. The very achievement of interstellar travel requires the kind of cooperation and peaceful thinking that makes violence obsolete." Jake leaned forward slightly, his human intensity causing several nearby students to shift uncomfortably in their seats. But what if they haven't evolved beyond it? What if someone who enjoys hurting others gets access to advanced technology? What if a species develops space travel not to explore and learn, but to find new victims? The question hung in the air like a dark cloud over the previously bright classroom. Keith, a tall, thin being whose species was renowned for their logical thinking, spoke up with characteristic precision. "The mathematical probability of such a scenario is negligible. The resources required for interstellar travel necessitate such a high level of social cooperation that aggressive tendencies would be eliminated as a prerequisite for development. Besides," added Vex, her crystalline body shifting through nervous color patterns, "the galactic defense protocols would prevent any truly dangerous species from threatening peaceful worlds. We have treaties, monitoring systems, and response networks that have maintained peace for a millennium." Jake wanted to point out that all of those systems assumed potential threats would follow the same rules and respect the same boundaries as the civilized species that created them. He wanted to ask what would happen if someone simply ignored the treaties and attacked anyway. But he could see the growing discomfort in his classmates' faces and decided to let the matter drop. Professor Ornith seemed relieved to move on to safer topics, but Jake noticed that her skin remained a pale, worried blue for the rest of the class period. As she discussed successful diplomatic missions and peaceful trade negotiations, Jake found himself scanning the room's transparent walls and noting the locations of exits and potential defensive positions. It was an old habit from Earth, where situational awareness could mean the difference between life and death, but here it only served to remind him of how fundamentally different his worldview was from his classmates. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he sat, in a classroom dedicated to teaching peace and understanding, being treated as a barely contained threat because his species had learned to survive on a world that didn't coddle its inhabitants. His very presence challenged their fundamental assumption that intelligence and pacifism were synonymous. As the lecture concluded, Jake gathered his materials and prepared for another walk through corridors filled with whispers and fearful glances. He had come to the academy hoping to bridge the gap between humanity and the galactic community, but increasingly, it felt like that gap might be unbridgeable. Perhaps some differences were too fundamental to overcome through mere education and good intentions. The philosophical discussion was interrupted by a sound that none of the students had ever heard before in their peaceful academic lives. A loud, piercing alarm began to blare throughout the building, its harsh mechanical wail cutting through the gentle ambience of the classroom like a knife. Red emergency lights immediately began flashing along the walls, casting an ominous crimson glow over the previously serene learning environment. The students looked around in confusion and growing alarm. Most had lived their entire lives on worlds where emergencies consisted of equipment malfunctions or weather delays. The Academy's emergency drills covered scenarios like power failures, medical emergencies, and theoretical natural disasters, but the intensity of this alarm suggested something far more serious. Professor Ornith immediately reached for her communication device, her skin shifting to the pale blue that indicated stress and concern. As she read the incoming messages, Jake watched her face transform from confusion to shock to something approaching terror. Her normally steady hands began to tremble as she absorbed whatever information was flowing across her screen. "Students, please remain calm," she announced, though her voice carried none of its usual confident authority. "This is not a drill. We are implementing emergency lockdown procedures immediately." As if responding to her words, the classroom's transparent walls began to shift and transform. The clear material that normally promoted openness and trust darkened and thickened, becoming solid metal barriers designed to seal the room completely. Emergency force fields activated across all openings, creating an additional layer of protection that hummed with barely audible energy. The room's lighting system automatically switched to emergency mode, bathing everything in a dim blue glow that made everyone's faces look ghostly and pale. The cheerful, open classroom had been transformed into something resembling a bunker, complete with its own air recycling system and emergency supplies. "What's happening?" asked Zilta, her empathic abilities clearly picking up the waves of fear and confusion radiating from everyone in the room. Her silver eyes were wide with an emotion her species rarely experienced, genuine terror. Professor Ornith was frantically scrolling through messages on her device, her expression growing more grave with each update. "There has been a security breach," she announced, her voice struggling to maintain professional calm. "An unauthorized vessel has landed on Academy grounds. All students and faculty are to remain in secure locations until further notice." Keith raised his thin hand, his logical mind seeking details even as his body language betrayed his growing anxiety. "What kind of unauthorized vessel, Professor? Surely our defense systems would have prevented any truly dangerous ship from approaching." Professor Ornith hesitated, clearly debating how much information to share with her terrified students. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The reports indicate it appears to be a Nexary ship." The effect of those words was immediate and electric. The room became so quiet that Jake could hear the individual breathing patterns of his alien classmates. Even Jake, who was still learning about the various species and threats in the galaxy, knew about the Nexary. They were the bogeymen of civilized space, raiders who attacked peaceful worlds and took prisoners to sell as slaves in the lawless outer systems where such trade was still tolerated. The Nexary represented everything the civilized galaxy had worked to leave behind. They were a species that had achieved advanced technology without evolving beyond their predatory nature. They raided isolated worlds, captured valuable specimens, and disappeared back into the unmapped regions of space where galactic law couldn't reach them. Vex began changing colors rapidly, her crystalline body shifting from blue to yellow to red in quick succession, a pattern that Jake had learned indicated severe distress. "But Nexary don't attack Academy worlds," she said, her voice taking on the brittle quality of breaking glass. "The treaties forbid it. They know that attacking an educational institution would bring the full weight of the Galactic Defense Force down on them." Jake spoke quietly, but his words carried clearly in the hushed classroom. "Treaties only work when both sides choose to follow them." Everyone turned to look at him, and for once, he wasn't the only one feeling afraid. His classmates, who had lived their entire lives in a bubble of safety and civilization, were suddenly confronting the reality that their peaceful worldview might have dangerous blind spots. Professor Ornith tried to contact Academy security, but her communication device showed only static interference. "The emergency communication system seems to be experiencing difficulties," she said, her professional training helping her maintain some semblance of calm despite the circumstances. Through the one small window that remained unblocked by the emergency barriers, Jake could see part of the Academy grounds. What he saw made his blood run cold. A large, dark ship sat in the middle of the previously peaceful gardens like a malignant tumor. Unlike the elegant, artistic vessels used by civilized species, this ship was purely functional, built for war rather than beauty. Its hull was scarred and blackened, and black smoke rose from its engines, carrying with it the smell of violence and destruction. The ship's design told a story of a species that had never learned to value beauty or harmony. Every line spoke of function over form, of a culture that saw vessels as weapons rather than art. It was the physical manifestation of everything the galactic community had tried to evolve beyond, sitting in their peaceful sanctuary like a serpent in paradise. Through the small observation window, Jake watched with growing dread as a figure emerged from the dark ship and began walking deliberately toward the Academy buildings. Even from a distance, the creature was unmistakably massive and threatening. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with a build that suggested both incredible strength and predatory grace. Thick armor plating covered its body, and Jake could make out the distinctive elongated claws that were the Nexari's primary natural weapons. The way it moved was what truly chilled Jake's blood. This wasn't the casual walk of someone exploring new territory or the hurried movement of someone on an urgent mission. This was the deliberate, patient stalking of a predator that knew its prey was trapped and helpless. Each step was measured and purposeful, the gait of something that had done this many times before and knew exactly how it would end. "There's a Nexari Ravager out there," Jake announced, his voice cutting through the whispered prayers and panic sounds his classmates were making. The other students pressed against the window to see for themselves, and when they spotted the armored figure making its way across their previously safe campus, several began to panic openly. Zilta started crying, her empathic abilities overwhelmed by the collective fear in the room and the alien emotions radiating from the approaching threat. Vex's crystal body began flashing bright red in rapid pulses, a color pattern Jake had never seen before but instinctively understood meant extreme danger. Even Keith, with all his logical intelligence and analytical capabilities, seemed unable to process what he was seeing. His species had built their entire civilization on the premise that rational thinking could solve any problem, but the approaching figure represented a type of threat that couldn't be reasoned with or negotiated away. "The emergency barriers will protect us," Professor Ornith said, but her voice shook with uncertainty. "Academy security will handle this situation. These systems were designed by the finest safety engineers in the galaxy." Jake studied the barriers that had sealed them into the classroom, his human survival instincts automatically assessing their defensive capabilities. What he saw didn't inspire confidence. The barriers were clearly robust and well-engineered, but they had been designed with very different threats in mind. They were built to contain students during emergencies, to protect against environmental hazards, and to maintain life support during system failures. They were not built to stop a determined attacker with advanced weapons and the experience to use them effectively. The Academy had been constructed by peaceful people who couldn't truly comprehend the reality of violent intent. Their idea of security was keeping students safe from accidents, not protecting them from something that actively wanted to harm them. A loud crash echoed through the building, the sound of metal being torn apart with tremendous force. The noise was followed by another crash, then another, each one closer and more violent than the last. The sounds were systematic and methodical, the work of something that was moving through the Academy's defenses with purpose and efficiency. "It's breaking through the outer defenses," Jake observed, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "That's impossible," Keith replied, his logical mind refusing to accept what his senses were telling him. "The security systems are the most advanced in the galaxy. They're designed to stop any conceivable threat." Another crash, much closer now, made the entire building shake slightly. Emergency lights flickered, and Jake could hear the distant sound of glass breaking and metal being twisted apart. "Advanced doesn't necessarily mean strong," Jake said, his eyes continuing to scan the room for potential defensive options. His behavior confused and frightened his classmates, who had never seen someone automatically assess threat levels and defensive positions. To them, his calm analysis in the face of mortal danger seemed almost as alien and threatening as the creature stalking toward them. The crashing sounds continued, growing louder and more frequent. Whatever was making its way through the Academy was working systematically, checking each room and corridor. Jake could hear the distinctive sound of doors being ripped open, the screech of metal being torn apart by something with incredible strength and sharp claws. Professor Ornith was frantically trying different communication channels, her skin cycling through various shades of blue and purple as stress and fear battled with her training. "I can't reach security," she announced, her voice beginning to crack. "All channels seem to be blocked or jammed." "Maybe security is already gone," Jake said quietly. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. These students and faculty had lived their entire lives in a galaxy where problems were solved by committees, where conflicts were resolved through mediation, and where violence was something that happened to other people on distant, uncivilized worlds. The concept that their protectors might have already been eliminated was almost too terrible to comprehend. The footsteps were in their corridor now. Heavy, deliberate steps that shook the floor with each impact, accompanied by the sound of doors being systematically torn open and searched. The Nexari was checking each room methodically, working its way toward them with the patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. The approaching footsteps stopped directly outside their classroom door, and everyone in the room held their breath in unison. For a moment, there was complete silence, broken only by the soft humming of the emergency force fields and the distant sound of the Academy's damaged systems trying to maintain normal operations. Then came the sound they had all been dreading, claws scraping against metal. The emergency barrier that was supposed to protect them was being tested by something with the tools and experience to break through it. What does it want? Zilta whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing sound of metal being scored and scratched. Prisoners, Jake replied without hesitation. Young, intelligent beings sell for high prices in the outer systems. Students from prestigious academies are particularly valuable because they represent the best genetic and intellectual material from peaceful species. Vex made a sound like breaking glass, her crystal body flashing so rapidly between colors that it hurt to look at her. The reality of their situation was sinking in for beings who had never imagined that they could become commodities to be bought and sold. The scraping grew louder and more violent. Through the barrier, they could hear heavy breathing and a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from something that genuinely enjoyed causing fear. Small pieces of debris began falling from the ceiling as the Nexari worked to break through their defenses. How long will the barrier hold? Jake asked, his voice maintaining an unsettling calm that contrasted sharply with the panic around him. Professor Ornith checked her emergency manual with shaking hands, scrolling through safety protocols that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. These barriers are rated to withstand Category 5 emergencies, she said, reading directly from the technical specifications. What's Category 5? Jake pressed. Student riots, equipment malfunctions, natural disasters, she replied, her voice growing smaller with each item on the list. What category is an armed Nexari Ravager? Professor Ornith looked at the manual again, scrolling through emergency classifications with growing desperation. Her face grew even more pale as the terrible truth became clear. There is no category for that. Such events were not considered possible when the safety systems were designed. The scraping outside grew more violent, and they could see the tips of claws beginning to poke through the metal barrier. The Academy's designers had built their defenses assuming they would face accidental threats or natural disasters, not something with both the ability and the desire to break through specifically to reach the people inside. Jake stood up and walked toward the compromised door, his movement causing his classmates to stare at him in shock and disbelief. What are you doing? Keith asked, his voice cracking with stress. Getting ready, Jake replied, his entire demeanor undergoing a subtle but profound transformation. Ready for what? Jake looked around the room at the frightened faces of his classmates. These were some of the most intelligent beings in the galaxy, species that had mastered faster-than-light travel, gravity manipulation, and energy conversion on scales that dwarfed human capabilities. But none of them had ever faced genuine mortal danger. They had grown up in a civilization that had forgotten how to fight because they had never needed to remember. Ready to do what humans do, Jake said simply. As he spoke, something fundamental changed in Jake's posture and presence. The nervous energy that had marked his first weeks at the Academy disappeared completely. His shoulders relaxed but became more square and solid. His breathing slowed rather than speeding up despite the approaching danger. Most unnervingly, his eyes took on a focused intensity that none of his classmates had ever seen before. It was the look of a predator sizing up another predator. The barrier groaned louder as more claws punched through the weakening metal. They could hear the creatures breathing more clearly now, along with sounds that might have been laughter. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, Jake felt truly useful. His classmates might be more intelligent than him in countless ways, but he possessed something they had never needed to develop, the knowledge of how to survive when civilization's rules no longer applied. The metal barrier began to buckle ominously. Whatever was coming through that door was about to meet something it had never encountered before, a human who had everything to protect and nothing left to lose. The emergency barrier gave one final, tortured groan before the claws tore through completely. A massive arm pushed through the opening, followed by a head covered in dark, scarred armor. The Nexari Ravager was even more terrifying up close than Jake had imagined. Its eyes glowed red behind a helmet designed specifically to intimidate its victims. Scars covered every visible piece of its skin, telling the story of a lifetime spent in violent conflict. Its claws were as long as kitchen knives and looked sharp enough to cut through steel plating. When it saw the room full of students pressed against the far wall, it made a sound that was unmistakably laughter. The students huddled together in terror. Zilta was sobbing quietly, her empathic abilities overwhelmed by the alien emotions radiating from their attacker. Vex had turned completely transparent, desperately trying to become invisible. Keith stood frozen in place, his advanced intellect completely unable to process the reality of immediate physical danger. Professor Ornith held up her hands in a gesture of surrender and spoke in the common galactic language. "Please," she said, her voice trembling with fear, "we are educators and students. We mean no harm to anyone." The Nexary tilted its massive head and replied in broken galactic standard, its voice a growling rasp that sent chills through everyone who heard it. "Harm not the point. You worth many credits. Smart ones always worth much." It began to step through the torn barrier, each footstep shaking the floor beneath its tremendous weight. The creature was clearly built for war, with thick armor plating and various weapons attached to its belt. This was what a species looked like when it had never stopped fighting, when it had achieved advanced technology without losing its predatory nature. That's when Jake stepped forward. His classmates expected Jake to plead for mercy like Professor Ornith had done, or perhaps to try reasoning with the creature. Instead, something extraordinary happened as Jake moved toward the Nexary. His entire body language underwent a transformation that was both subtle and profound. The nervous energy that had characterized his behavior during his weeks at the academy vanished completely. His shoulders settled into a more confident stance while his breathing actually slowed rather than accelerated. Most striking of all, his eyes fixed on the Nexary with an intensity that none of his classmates had ever witnessed. It was the unmistakable gaze of a predator evaluating another predator. "That's far enough," Jake said in English, his voice carrying a tone that transcended language barriers. The Nexary didn't understand the words, but it clearly understood the challenge. For the first time since entering the room, it stopped moving forward, its glowing red eyes focusing on Jake with sudden interest. Jake began walking in a slow circle, maintaining eye contact with the creature. To his classmates' amazement, the massive alien turned to follow his movement, as if responding to some primal instinct it didn't fully understand. Jake wasn't cowering or fleeing. He was positioning himself directly between the Nexary and the other students. "What is he doing?" Keith whispered, his logical mind struggling to process Jake's behavior. Zilta wiped her eyes and watched Jake's movement with growing wonder. Her empathic abilities allowed her to sense something that the others couldn't perceive. "He's not afraid," she said in amazement. "He's calculating." Jake continued his deliberate movement, forcing the Nexary to turn its back toward the other students as it tracked his path. As he moved, he spoke in a low, steady voice that somehow remained calm despite the mortal danger. "Keith, how much does this thing weigh?" "What?" Keith was confused by the seemingly random question. "Its weight. Based on its size and apparent muscle density, what would you estimate its mass to be?" Keith's brain automatically began performing the calculation despite his fear. "Approximately 400 pounds, assuming standard density for Nexary physiology." "Good. Zilta, what emotions is it feeling right now?" Zilta concentrated despite her terror, using her empathic abilities to read the alien creature's mental state. "Confidence. Amusement. It thinks we're completely helpless. But there's something else, curiosity. It's curious about you specifically." "Excellent. Vex, this classroom has a gravity generator, right? For teaching about different planetary conditions." Vex's crystal body flickered back to partial visibility as she forced herself to focus on Jake's question. "Yes, but why would you? Where's the control panel?" "Behind Professor Ornith's desk, but you can't operate it without authorization codes." Jake smiled for the first time in weeks, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Professor Ornith, I need those codes." Professor Ornith stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Martinez, what are you planning? You can't possibly fight that thing. It's trained for combat from birth. It has weapons and armor." "So did the first human who ever killed a cave bear," Jake replied calmly. "The authorization codes, please." Something in his voice made Professor Ornith reach for her control panel with trembling hands. Her training and years of experience told her to trust the emergency protocols, but something deeper, some ancient survival instinct that even her peaceful species retained, told her to trust the human. The Nexary was growing tired of being ignored. It took another step forward and spoke in its broken galactic standard. "Enough talk. You come now. No make trouble, no get hurt too much." Jake held up one hand toward the creature without taking his eyes off it. "Professor, the codes. Now." "Jake," she whispered, "you can't fight that thing. Look at it." "So did every human who ever survived something bigger and stronger than they were," Jake said. "The codes, please." Professor Ornith entered her authorization with shaking fingers. The Nexery noticed the movement toward the control panel and snarled, reaching for a weapon on its belt. But Jake was already moving. He didn't run toward the creature or away from it. Instead, he dove to one side in a controlled roll, disappearing behind one of the heavy classroom desks just as the Nexery's claws swept through the space where he had been standing. Gravity to 1.5 Earth normal, Jake called out from behind his cover. Professor Ornith's training kicked in, and she activated the gravity change without conscious thought. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Nexery stumbled as the increased gravitational field hit it, its heavy armor suddenly becoming a significant burden rather than just protection. 400 pounds became 600 pounds in an instant. Jake, who had grown up in Earth's naturally heavy gravity, barely noticed the change. He popped up from behind the desk and grabbed a crystalline data storage unit from Professor Ornith's collection. With a motion that looked effortless but was actually precisely calculated, he hurled it at the Nexery's head. The crystal struck the creature's helmet with a sound like a gunshot. The Nexery staggered, more from surprise than actual damage, but it was enough to disrupt its balance in the increased gravity. Jake was already moving again, his actions flowing from one to the next with practiced efficiency. His classmates watched in amazement as their quiet, awkward human classmate transformed into something they had never seen before. Every movement was purposeful and calculated. Every action served multiple functions. Jake wasn't just surviving, he was hunting. Zilta, Jake called out as he ducked a swipe from the Nexery's claws, is it getting angry or scared? Both, she replied, her voice filled with wonder. It's confused. This isn't how prey is supposed to behave. Jake grabbed another object from a nearby desk and threw it with perfect accuracy at the Nexery's knee joint. The creature roared in pain and fury as the improvised projectile found its mark. It had expected easy victims, not a fight. Keith, Jake said, rolling to avoid a blast from the Nexery's energy weapon, what's the structural weakness of Nexery armor? Keith's brain worked automatically despite his fear. The joints must be flexible, so they have less protection at the knees, elbows, and neck. Perfect. Vex, can you create a bright light flash with your crystal body? Yes, but why would you want me to? On my signal. Jake was no longer the isolated exchange student who sat alone at meals. He was a human being doing what humans had always done, adapting, improvising, and refusing to surrender when facing a superior enemy. The Nexery lunged forward with its claws fully extended, intending to end the fight with overwhelming force. But Jake didn't try to block the attack or dodge away from it. Instead, he did something that violated every tactical assumption the creature had ever learned. He stepped directly into the attack. Grabbing the Nexery's wrist at the moment of maximum extension, Jake used the creature's own momentum and the increased gravity to send it crashing into the wall. The impact shook the entire room, and while the Nexery wasn't seriously injured, it looked uncertain for the first time since entering the classroom. Now, Vex. Jake shouted. Vex's crystal body exploded into brilliant white light, a defensive mechanism her species had evolved to confuse predators. The Nexery's enhanced vision, designed for low-light hunting, was completely overwhelmed. It stumbled blindly, clawing at its helmet while trying to clear its sight. Jake didn't waste the opportunity. Moving behind the disoriented creature, he began working on the fasteners of its armor with practiced efficiency. His hands found weak points and pressure releases that he shouldn't have known about. How do you know how to do that? Professor Ornith asked in amazement. Earth has a lot of dangerous animals, Jake replied, still working methodically on the armor. You learn to think like they think. This thing is just a bigger, meaner animal with better tools. By the time the Nexery's vision cleared, Jake had already removed half of its back armor plating. When the creature spun around to attack, it found Jake holding a piece of its own armor as an improvised shield. For the first time, Jake's classmates truly understood what it meant to be from a death world. The traits that had made them uncomfortable, his constant alertness, his physical awareness, his instinctive consideration of violence as an option, were exactly what they needed now. Jake wasn't just fighting the Nexery, he was demonstrating that sometimes the galaxy needed beings who remembered how to be dangerous when protecting the innocent. The Nexery Ravager shook its head, clearing its vision completely. When it saw Jake holding a piece of its own armor, something changed in its glowing red eyes. The amusement was gone, replaced by the focused attention of a predator that had finally recognized it was in a real fight. The creature pulled a long energy blade from its belt, the weapon humming with deadly power and casting purple light across the destroyed classroom. This was no longer a simple raid for easy prisoners. Students, move to the far corner, Jake said without taking his eyes off his opponent. Stay behind the desks. His classmates scrambled to obey. For the first time since Jake had arrived at the academy, they were following his lead without question or hesitation. The Nexari spoke in its harsh native language, then switched to broken galactic standard. You fight good for soft-walled prey, but now you die like rest. Jake adjusted his grip on the armor piece he was using as a shield. Maybe, he replied calmly, but you're going to earn it. The fight that followed was unlike anything the Peaceful Academy had ever witnessed. The Nexari attacked with the fury and skill of a lifetime warrior, its energy blade carving through furniture and scoring deep grooves in the walls. But Jake was never where the creature expected him to be. He had been watching the Nexari's movement patterns since it entered the room, noting how it favored its right side and telegraphed its attacks. He used the increased gravity, the improvised weapons, and the classroom's layout to systematically neutralize every advantage the creature possessed. When the Nexari tried to corner him with explosive projectiles, Jake used the classroom's emergency containment system, force fields designed to contain dangerous experiments, to trap the creature in an energy prison of its own making. How did you know about that system?